I used to think intelligence was one thing you either had a lot of or didn't. Then I started paying closer attention to how the people around me actually think. Not what they conclude, but how they get there. And the picture got a lot more interesting. One friend meets every idea, including her own, with the same first move: find the weakest point and press on it. She can't help herself. Hands her a plan, a theory, even a compliment, and some part of her is already testing where it might fail. Another friend can't rest with a conclusion until he's dismantled it down to something he considers undeniable, brick by brick, refusing to build on ground he hasn't personally checked. A third barely reasons in a straight line at all. She reaches for a story, an image, a comparison, and somehow arrives at the same truth the other two do, just from a completely different direction, as if logic were only one way of leading to the same place. None of them are smarter than the others, exactly. They're just built differently. And once I noticed that, I couldn't stop seeing it everywhere. In the way people argue, the way they solve problems, the way they even describe their own confusion when something doesn't add up. Everyone has a structure they default to, a shape their thinking naturally falls into before they've consciously chosen anything at all. Here's what struck me though. Almost none of us picked our architecture. We absorbed it. From a parent who debated everything at the dinner table, from a teacher who rewarded a particular kind of answer, from whatever books happened to be on the shelf when we were young enough to be shaped by them. It settled into us the way an accent does. Not because we decided it was correct, but because it was simply what surrounded us, day after day, until it stopped feeling like a choice at all. And like an accent, it's mostly invisible from the inside. You don't experience your own thinking as one option among several, you experience it as thinking itself, as just how things obviously are. The skeptic doesn't feel skeptical, she feels realistic. The storyteller doesn't feel like he's avoiding logic, he feels like he's finally getting somewhere true. The person who needs everything traced back to first principles doesn't feel rigid, he feels careful. That's the strange part. The very structure that shapes what we can see is also the thing that keeps us from noticing it's there at all. What I find genuinely hopeful about this is that it doesn't have to stay invisible forever. Once you can name the shape of your own thinking, you can start to ask what it's built to catch and what it's built to miss, where it serves you and where it quietly limits you without ever announcing itself. The person who lives by first principles can learn to sit inside a story for a while without immediately taking it apart looking for the seams. The person who reasons in analogies can learn to push past a pattern and ask whether it actually holds up under pressure once the comparison runs out. Nobody has to abandon their native architecture, but almost everybody could stand to borrow a room or two from a different one just to see how it changes the view. I keep coming back to a simple question, one I don't think I can fully answer about myself yet. What does my own thinking reach for first when I'm not paying attention and nobody's asking me to explain myself? Is it comparison, doubt, first causes, something else entirely, something I haven't even named yet? I suspect most of us walk around with a structure we've never actually looked at directly, using it every single day to decide what counts as true, what counts as obvious, what counts as worth arguing about at all. Maybe that's worth sitting with for a moment, not as a problem to solve, but as a kind of quiet self portrait, still waiting to be sketched. There's a particular kind of quiet that happens right after someone shares an idea they're excited about, and you feel the first objection arrive before you've even finished being happy for them. I know that quite well. I've lived on both sides of it, the one offering the idea and the one already picking it apart before it's finished landing. You could call it skepticism, but that word makes it sound colder than it usually is. For the friend I'm thinking of, it's less a mood and more a reflex, the same way some people reflexively finish a stranger's sentence. Hand her a plan, and her mind doesn't ask, "What's good about this?" It asks, "Where does this break?"
Not out of cruelty, out of a kind of care that got wired backward somewhere. A belief that the fastest route to something true is finding everything false first. We tend to treat this posture as either a gift or a flaw, depending on which side of it we're standing on that day. When you're building something fragile and half formed, the skeptic in the room can feel like an act of sabotage, showing up right when you needed someone to simply believe you. But when the stakes are real, when a decision actually matters, when money or trust or safety is on the line, that same instinct becomes the only person in the room asking the question everyone else was too polite to ask. I think what makes the objection first mind so useful and so exhausting is that it doesn't discriminate. It applies the same pressure to a stranger's business plan and to its own Tuesday morning hope. Ask that friend how her week went, and some part of her is already stress testing her own answer before she gives it to you. There's no separate setting for gentle mode. The blade only comes in one edge. What I find myself wondering, though, is what that reflex is actually protecting. Because underneath every habitual skeptic I've known, there's usually an old memory of believing something too easily and paying for it. A bad deal, a broken promise, a plan that collapsed because nobody in the room was willing to say the obvious, uncomfortable thing out loud. The armor didn't come from nowhere. It came from a moment when nobody else was armored, and it cost them. That's the part worth sitting with, I think. We call it a personality trait, but it might be closer to scar tissue that turned out to be useful, a wound that got repurposed into a skill. And once you see it that way, it's harder to resent in other people and maybe even in yourself. The instinct to find the flaw first isn't a character defect, it's a strategy that worked once badly enough to become permanent. The cost, though, is real too, and worth naming honestly. A mind that leads with a counterargument can become a mind that struggles to simply receive something. A compliment, a piece of good news, a moment that doesn't need improving. You can get so good at finding the crack in every wall that you forget some walls are just walls, solid, holding up exactly what they're supposed to hold up. I don't think the answer is to sand the edge off entirely. A room full of people who only agree with each other builds nothing worth trusting. But maybe the skill worth developing isn't suppressing the objection, it's learning when to let it wait. Letting an idea breathe for one full minute before you touch it with a blade. Not forever, just long enough to find out what it might have become before you decide what's wrong with it. I keep thinking about how much of what any of us calls just being realistic is really just an old wound, still working the shift.
I have a friend who cannot accept a conclusion until he's walked all the way back to the beginning of it. Tell him something is true, and his first question is never, "How do you know exactly?" It's more fundamental than that. It's, "What is this actually standing on?" He wants the foundation, not the story built on top of it. You've probably met someone like this. In a conversation, they're the one who stops the momentum right when everyone else is ready to move on, asking what a word actually means before they'll use it, refusing to accept "everyone agrees" as evidence of anything. It can feel in the moment like they're slowing things down on purpose. Sometimes they are, but usually they're doing something harder than slowing down. They're refusing to build on ground they haven't personally tested. We call this first principle thinking now, like it's a productivity technique you can bolt onto any problem. But for the people who actually live this way, it isn't a technique at all. It's closer to a discomfort with borrowed certainty. Most of us are willing to accept a conclusion because someone credible said it, because it matches what we already believed, because arguing about it seems exhausting. The first principles mind, it can't quite do that. Borrowed certainty doesn't feel like certainty to them. It feels like standing on a floor they haven't checked. There's something genuinely admirable in this, and I don't want to undersell it. A person willing to trace an idea back to bedrock is a person who can catch an error everyone else walked right past, because everyone else stopped questioning 3 steps too early. When an entire room has quietly agreed to accept an assumption, this is the person who asks without any hostility whether the assumption was ever actually true. Entire fields have been advanced by people who simply refuse to stop asking why one more time than was comfortable. But we should be honest with the cost too, because there is one. Tracing everything back to first principles takes time, and time is the one resource none of us actually get more of.
You can spend so long verifying the foundation that you never get around to building anything on top of it. There's a kind of paralysis that looks like rigor from the outside, but feels from the inside like being unable to trust your own footing no matter how solid the ground actually is. Some questions genuinely don't need to be reopened every single time. I think what's interesting is that this instinct, like the skeptics, probably has a history behind it. Somewhere along the way, most first principles thinkers were handed a conclusion that turned out to be false, dressed up as something obvious. Maybe an authority who was wrong, maybe a widely shared belief that quietly collapsed the moment someone actually checked. Once you've watched everyone knows this turn out to be false, it's hard to ever again accept everyone knows this as a reason to believe anything. What we might learn from this friend isn't to interrogate every single claim down to bedrock. None of us have the hours for that. And most days, most claims don't deserve it. It's narrower than that. It's choosing deliberately which handful of beliefs actually matter enough to earn that kind of scrutiny and letting the rest simply be useful without demanding they also be proven. I wonder what would happen if each of us picked just one inherited belief this week and ask honestly what it's actually standing on. Not to tear it down necessarily, just to finally know for certain whether it was ever load bearing at all.
My third friend doesn't argue the way the other two do. She doesn't hunt for the weak point, and she doesn't trace things back to bedrock. Ask her why she believes something, and she'll usually answer with a story. This reminds me of that. This is basically the same shape as this other thing that happened. Here's what it's like. For a long time, I assumed that was a workaround, a softer path for someone who found logic too dry to hold her attention. I don't think that anymore. Watch her reason through something difficult, and you notice she gets to the same place the logicians do, just by a completely different route. She's not avoiding rigor, she's using a different kind of rigor, one that runs on resemblance instead of deduction. Where the first principle's mind asks what something is built on, she asks what it's like. What else behaves this way? What pattern is this actually an instance of? We tend to rank these approaches without quite meaning to. Logic gets treated as the serious mode of thought, and story gets treated as the mode you fall back on when you can't do the serious kind. But that ranking doesn't survive much scrutiny. Some of the most important scientific breakthroughs in history arrived first as an image, a comparison, a story someone told themselves before they had any proof. The idea of natural selection reportedly started to click for Darwin, partly through a comparison to breeders selecting traits in pigeons. Not a syllogism, a resemblance. There's a reason story works as a mode of thought, and not just a mode of entertainment. Analogy lets you borrow structure from a domain you already understand and apply it somewhere you don't, which means they can reach conclusions that pure deduction, working step by step from scratch, would take far longer to arrive at, if it arrived there at all. You're not starting from nothing when you think in story. You're starting from every pattern you've ever lived through, all at once running quietly in the background. The risk, of course, is that a good story can feel true even when it isn't one. A compelling comparison has a kind of gravity to it. Once you've found the resemblance, it's hard to notice where the resemblance actually ends, and even harder to admit that a metaphor that felt so right might simply be wrong. We're drawn to narratives so naturally that we sometimes mistake the pleasure of a satisfying comparison for the confirmation of a correct one. A story that explains everything, that fits a little too perfectly, deserves exactly the scrutiny most of us are least inclined to give it. What I've come to think is that story-based thinking and logic-based thinking aren't actually opposites. They're more like two instruments built to solve different parts of the same problem. Logic is precise, but slow to generate anything new. It's excellent at testing an idea once you already have one. Analogy is vast and generative, brilliant at producing the idea in the first place, but weaker at verifying it holds up once you look closely. Used together, one hands the other something worth checking, and the other tells it whether the resemblance was ever real. I think about my friend differently now, watching how quickly she arrives somewhere true by a path that never once looked like reasoning to me until I paid attention. Maybe the real question isn't whether story or logic is the more trustworthy tool.
It's whether you know which one you reach for first and whether you ever double check it with the other.
I don't remember choosing how I think. I remember choosing what I believe plenty of times, changing my mind about a political question, a relationship, a version of myself I used to be sure of. But the actual machinery underneath those beliefs, the way I go about deciding what counts as evidence in the first place, that part feels like it was already running before I ever noticed it was there. You can trace an accent to a place. Someone raised in a certain region says certain words a certain way, and it's rarely a mystery why. You can point to the town, the household, the year spent absorbing sounds before you had any say in the matter. Thought architecture works the same way, except almost nobody bothers to trace it because it doesn't announce itself the way an accent does. Nobody hears you reason through a problem and says, "Oh, you must be from a family of engineers or a household where nothing was ever taken at face value." But we could trace it if we tried. A kid raised at a dinner table where every claim got interrogated learns without anyone explicitly teaching it that ideas exist to be tested. A kid raised somewhere that valued a good story over a precise argument learns that meaning travels through narrative first. A classroom that rewarded the fastest correct answer produces a different kind of thinker than one that rewarded the most interesting question. None of this shows up on a report card. It just quietly becomes the shape of how a person approaches everything for the rest of their life. What strikes me is how early this settles in, long before anyone would call it a decision. By the time you're old enough to notice you have a way of thinking, you've already been using it for years, the same way you were speaking with an accent long before you knew accents existed at all. We inherit far more than opinions from where we grew up. We inherit the entire apparatus that produces the opinions. There's a comfort in that, honestly. It means the tendencies we sometimes judge ourselves for, being too skeptical, too slow to commit, or too quick to reach for a comparison instead of a proof, usually aren't personal failures. They're inheritance. Nobody sat down and chose to become the person who can't accept an idea without dismantling it first. That person was built gradually out of 1,000 small moments nobody was keeping track of. But inheritance isn't the same as destiny, and this is where it gets interesting. An accent can soften with enough time somewhere else. It can even change entirely if you spend long enough immersed in a different way of speaking. Thought architecture seems to work the same way. Not fixed, just deeply grooved, the way water carves a channel it will keep following unless something forces a new path. You can move to a new town for a decade, so to speak. You can spend deliberate time inside a mode of thinking that isn't your native one. And something in the underlying structure genuinely shifts. I keep wondering what my own inheritance actually is. Which part of how I think came from a specific room, a specific person, a specific year, and which part I've actually chosen since. I'm not sure I could untangle it fully even if I tried. And maybe that's fine. Maybe some threads are meant to stay woven together. But I suspect most of us are carrying an accent we've never once consciously heard ourselves speaking in.
Every lens that brings something into focus blurs something else at the same time. That's not a flaw in the lens, it's what a lens is. You can't build a tool for seeing without also building, by the same stroke, a tool for not seeing something else. Thought architecture works exactly like that, and I think this is a part most of us skip over when we're busy admiring our own way of thinking. The skeptic's instinct to find the weak point in an idea is genuinely powerful. It catches flaws almost nobody else notices. But that same instinct, running constantly, makes it hard to recognize an idea that's simply good, with nothing to catch. Because the mind trained to hunt for cracks starts to feel suspicious of a wall with none. The first principles mind that traces everything back to bedrock build on unshakable ground, but it can be strangely blind to conclusions that are true and useful long before they've been fully proven. Intuitions correct people acted on for centuries before anyone worked out why. The story-driven mind sees connections others miss entirely, and can also mistake a compelling resemblance for an actual fact, simply because it felt so satisfying to notice. We like to think of our strengths and our weaknesses as separate columns, unrelated entries on the same list. I don't think that's accurate. I think they're usually the same trait viewed from two different angles. The very same structure that makes you excellent at one kind of seeing is, by mechanical necessity, the reason you're weak at another kind. You don't get the strength without the blind spot hatched. They arrive as a single unit. What makes this hard to notice about yourself is that a blind spot, by definition, doesn't feel like anything. It's simply the absence of a question you never thought to ask, because your particular architecture never generates that question in the first place. The skeptic doesn't feel like she's missing the good in things. She feels thorough. The romantic doesn't feel like he's ignoring the flaw in the plan. He feels inspired. Nobody experiences their own blind spot from the inside, which is exactly what makes it a blind spot instead of just a known limitation. This is, I think, the real argument for surrounding yourself with people who think differently than you do. Not as a nice diversity talking point, but as a genuinely practical necessity. If your own architecture can't generate certain questions, you need someone standing next to you whose architecture generates them automatically. The first principles thinker needs the storyteller in the room, because the storyteller will notice the resemblance the logician was structurally incapable of seeing. The skeptic needs a person who defaults to belief, if only to catch the good idea the skeptic would have talked everyone out of. It's worth noticing, too, that this is probably why the most interesting teams and partnerships rarely form between people who think identically. A room full of skeptics will catch every flaw and generate almost nothing new to catch flaws in. A room full of storytellers will produce endless compelling ideas and verify almost none of them. It's the friction between different architectures, not the harmony, that seems to produce the most reliable thinking. Each person's blind spot getting covered, almost accidentally, by someone else's strength. I keep returning to this thought. Maybe the goal was never to build a perfect architecture with no blind spots at all, because that architecture doesn't exist and probably can't. Maybe the more honest goal is simply knowing exactly where your particular blind spot sits and building a habit of checking that specific direction on purpose. The way you check a mirror you know has always had a slightly warped edge.
So, say you've actually located it, the shape of your own thinking, the room you default to without ever deciding to walk in. What then? Naming an architecture is one thing. Living differently inside it is another problem entirely, and a much harder one. I think the instinct, once you notice your own pattern, is to try to demolish it. If you've realized you lead with objection, you might decide the fix is to simply stop objecting, to force agreement where doubt used to live. If you've realized you need everything traced to bedrock before you'll trust it, you might try to just accept things faster on principle, as an act of willpower. I don't think this works, and I don't think it's supposed to. You can't overwrite 20 years of grooved habit through sheer determination on a Tuesday. The channel water has carved doesn't disappear because you decided you'd rather it ran somewhere else. What seems to actually work is smaller and stranger than demolition. It's borrowing, not becoming a different kind of thinker, but visiting, deliberately, a room that isn't yours. The way you might spend a season living in a country whose language you don't speak fluently. Not to abandon your native tongue, but to come back changed by having used a different one for a while. For the skeptic, this might mean practicing something almost uncomfortable, sitting with an idea for a full minute before finding its flaw on purpose, even though every instinct says to press the weak point immediately. Not forever, just long enough to notice what the idea might have become before the blade came out. For the person who needs bedrock under everything, it might mean deliberately accepting one useful conclusion on the strength of pattern alone, without demanding the full proof, just to see what moving that fast actually feels like. For the storyteller, it might mean picking one favorite analogy and interrogating it the way a skeptic would, asking where exactly the resemblance breaks down. None of this is comfortable, and I think that discomfort is actually the signal that it's working.
A room that isn't yours is supposed to feel slightly wrong at first. The way speaking a second language feels stiff and effortful long before it feels natural. If borrowing a different mode of thinking felt easy immediately, you probably weren't borrowing anything. You were just doing your usual thing with different words attached to it. There's also a timing question worth thinking about, because not every room is meant to be visited in every moment. You wouldn't want a skeptic's slow, cautious testing running during a genuine emergency, when a fast decision matters more than a perfect one. You wouldn't want a storyteller's loose associative leaps guiding you through a contract that you're about to sign. Part of what borrowing teaches you over time isn't just how to use a different room, it's when. Which architecture actually fits the problem in front of you, rather than whichever one happens to be the one you always reach for out of habit. We tend to assume growth means becoming more of what we already are, sharpening the same blade further. But there's a different kind of growth available too. One that looks like addition instead of refinement, not sharpening the skeptic's blade, but building a second tool the skeptic never had and learning when to reach for which one. I think this is closer to what people mean when they describe someone as wise rather than merely smart. Not a bigger version of one architecture, but a person who's slowly accumulated several, and knows, almost instinctively now, which room a given problem actually calls for. I keep wondering which room I choose to visit first if I were being honest about where my own architecture runs thinnest. I suspect most of us already know the answer. We just haven't been willing to walk through that particular door yet.
Everything I've said so far assumes there's time. Time to notice your architecture, time to name it, time to deliberately borrow a room that isn't yours. But most of what actually tests how you think doesn't arrive politely with room to prepare. It arrives as a phone call at the wrong hour, a diagnosis, a door slammed somewhere in the house. And I think that's exactly when architecture stops being an interesting idea to examine and becomes the only thing you actually have. Under real pressure, the borrowed rooms tend to disappear first. All that deliberate practice, the skeptic learning patience, the storyteller learning scrutiny. It's real, but it's fragile, and pressure burns off the fragile parts fast. What's left standing in a genuine crisis is usually the oldest structure, the one installed before you had any say in the matter, the native architecture underneath everything else. It's the skeptic who reaches for evidence at 2 a.m. when someone you love is in the hospital and the doctor hasn't come back yet, demanding numbers, demanding a straight answer, unable to accept comfort that isn't backed by something concrete. And it's the storyteller who reaches for a shape instead, some version of "we've survived worse," because the mind needs somewhere to stand, and a story is the fastest ground available when nothing else is solid. I don't think this is maybe a real reason to do the quieter work beforehand, not so architecture disappears under pressure, because it won't, but so you have some familiarity with your own default before the moment arrives that actually test it. Not to fight your instinct in the crisis itself, there won't be time for that, but to have already noticed in calmer weather where that instinct tends to help and where it tends to run away with you. Crisis doesn't build character exactly. It reveals whatever architecture was already there, all at once, with nowhere left to hide it. I wonder what mine would show if it were tested tomorrow. I suspect I already know. I used to think intelligence was one thing you either had a lot of or didn't. Then I started paying closer attention to how the people around me actually think. Not what they conclude, but how they get there. And the picture got a lot more interesting. One friend meets every idea, including her own, with the same first move: find the weakest point and press on it. She can't help herself. Hands her a plan, a theory, even a compliment, and some part of her is already testing where it might fail. Another friend can't rest with a conclusion until he's dismantled it down to something he considers undeniable, brick by brick, refusing to build on ground he hasn't personally checked. A third barely reasons in a straight line at all. She reaches for a story, an image, a comparison, and somehow arrives at the same truth the other two do,
just from a completely different direction, as if logic were only one way of leading to the same place. None of them are smarter than the others, exactly. They're just built differently. And once I noticed that, I couldn't stop seeing it everywhere. In the way people argue, the way they solve problems, the way they even describe their own confusion when something doesn't add up. Everyone has a structure they default to, a shape their thinking naturally falls into before they've consciously chosen anything at all. Here's what struck me though. Almost none of us picked our architecture. We absorbed it. From a parent who debated everything at the dinner table, from a teacher who rewarded a particular kind of answer, from whatever books happened to be on the shelf when we were young enough to be shaped by them. It settled into us the way an accent does. Not because we decided it was correct, but because it was simply what surrounded us, day after day, until it stopped feeling like a choice at all. And like an accent, it's mostly invisible from the inside. You don't experience your own thinking as one option among several, you experience it as thinking itself, as just how things obviously are. The skeptic doesn't feel skeptical, she feels realistic. The storyteller doesn't feel like he's avoiding logic, he feels like he's finally getting somewhere true. The person who needs everything traced back to first principles doesn't feel rigid, he feels careful. That's the strange part. The very structure that shapes what we can see is also the thing that keeps us from noticing it's there at all. What I find genuinely hopeful about this is that it doesn't have to stay invisible forever. Once you can name the shape of your own thinking, you can start to ask what it's built to catch and what it's built to miss, where it serves you and where it quietly limits you without ever announcing itself. The person who lives by first principles can learn to sit inside a story for a while without immediately taking it apart looking for the seams. The person who reasons in analogies can learn to push past a pattern and ask whether it actually holds up under pressure once the comparison runs out. Nobody has to abandon their native architecture, but almost everybody could stand to borrow a room or two from a different one just to see how it changes the view. I keep coming back to a simple question, one I don't think I can fully answer about myself yet. What does my own thinking reach for first when I'm not paying attention and nobody's asking me to explain myself? Is it comparison, doubt, first causes, something else entirely, something I haven't even named yet? I suspect most of us walk around with a structure we've never actually looked at directly, using it every single day to decide what counts as true, what counts as obvious, what counts as worth arguing about at all. Maybe that's worth sitting with for a moment, not as a problem to solve, but as a kind of quiet self portrait, still waiting to be sketched.